Welcome back, everyone. You are watching the Watchdog live. Sorry about that little glitch. Of course, this is live television. You can expect things like that to go wrong at some point, but we are back. And make sure that you do retweet this link. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and that you also follow us on Twitter at WD Newswire. So I do want to pick it back up where we left off. Kevin, I know you were making a point, so I'll let you take it from here.
And I won't start from the middle. I'll just say that Edward Fitzgerald is the defense attorney for Assange, and he stood in the court and said something to the effect of, how can you be accused of committing treason in the United States if you're not a U.S. citizen? And I think it's important because before we had the glitch, we were talking about what makes WikiLeaks a unique media organization. And for one, it's true that they're non-state. That's the only accurate part of what Mike Pompeo says, because they've always celebrated being a stateless news organization. And what happens all the time, and I think why we need to talk about this idea of how can you commit treason against the United States if you're not a U.S. citizen, is because for the most part, a lot of the criticism in the U.S. press, but I think it also filters out and leaks into the global press, is that he's anti-American, and a lot of the criticism against him and the way that they try to smear and assassinate his character comes from the way in which he aligns himself with countries or people who are considered enemies of the state to the U.S. government. And he's under no obligation to not speak to these people. I mean, as a person who is an Australian, and again, like, even if his government doesn't want him to talk to these people, we still should talk about principles of freedom of association, of being able to have these kinds of interactions. But there's nothing that says, he can't go on Russia Today to do an interview, to have a broadcast. There's nothing that says that he can't align himself with these different countries. There's nothing to say that he can't have a relationship with Rafael Correa in Ecuador because the U.S. doesn't like that Rafael Correa runs a left-wing government and says that you can't have a U.S. military base in Ecuador. But I think a lot of the way in which Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have been willing to oppose what the U.S. wants in its foreign policy agenda. Again, not to say that WikiLeaks is only entirely focused on opposing the U.S., but in my view, I kind of feel like a lot of the way we view WikiLeaks is colored entirely by the way the U.S. has attacked WikiLeaks. So they're actually pushing it in. So, we've heard a lot in the last in the last 4 to 5 years about whether or not they were provided information from Russian intelligence, and that was how we got the DNC emails that revealed all of this information about how the DNC was stacking its primaries against Bernie Sanders, or put another way, anointing Hillary Clinton the candidate for the Democratic Party. And the reason why sources maybe somewhat connected to that region of the world might reach out to WikiLeaks is because WikiLeaks is being pushed into a direction where they're seen as an opposition force to the United States. And I think one thing that the prosecution will never grapple with, but should have to reckon with, at least outside of court proceedings, is how U.S. policy has turned WikiLeaks into an organization that they view as their opponent. Because I think it wasn't WikiLeaks that decided to challenge the U.S. It was the United States that decided to challenge WikiLeaks.
I thought there was, on the first day, there was kind of a revealing slip of the tongue by the government. They said, instead of saying send him to the U.S., they said return him to the U.S.
Yeah.
But he's an Australian citizen. He should not have to be bound by the U.S. Espionage Act, and that's something we should really remember. This is, for other reasons, a real danger to the U.S. First Amendment, and the Espionage Act is very dangerous for U.S. citizens. But this is a danger for citizens around the world. This is the U.S. wants to have military bases around the world. It should expect that people are going to push back against that around the world. And so it wants to claim that the world is the U.S. jurisdiction, that any citizen anywhere, if they publish something that the U.S. doesn't like, the U.S. can retaliate however it wants.
And then there's also this very selective choosing of which laws apply to Julian Assange and not. So it's like he is being accused of being treasonous, but he is not. He's not afforded the protections of the First Amendment.
Right. We've seen the Espionage Act applies to him, but the First Amendment doesn't. Yeah. So it's just.
Right, which I'll just quote James Goodall, who's the former general counsel of New York Times, who I interviewed before I came to cover these proceedings in London, who made it very clear that yes, you can't have it both ways. If you're the government, if you're going to try him under the Espionage Act, as Nathan just said, you get First Amendment rights. But if because he's a foreigner, the Espionage Act does not apply, if in fact U.S. secrecy laws do not apply to people who are not U.S. citizens, then you can't prosecute him in the first place. Then you shouldn't be extraditing him at all. We also should take this moment to throw out this wild evolution that we might be headed towards where, and the defense has actually spoken about this, where various countries throughout the world that have powers are now going to enforce their own secrecy laws on people who are foreign journalists. That's what the United States is opening up. And it's going to come from Russia, China, Iran, Israel. It's going to come from any of these countries. It could come from Turkey. We've seen tremendous crackdowns on people in terms of freedom of expression. It could come from European countries. It could come selectively at a moment when there are political crises in these countries. They might turn to this in order to go after somebody because it's expedient. That's what the United States is doing. They're making it more dangerous for people to be global correspondents.
And we've seen the first sign of that with Glenn Greenwald in Brazil, the first sort of other government basically copy and pasting the charges against Assange and using very similar charges against an American journalist in Brazil.
I think that America really does set the standard worldwide, because we often see that human rights abuses in the West, in America, are often used to justify human rights abuses elsewhere in the world.
I'm probably going to forget my point again as soon as I start speaking. But the point that I was going to raise is that as soon as I do this, I always forget what I'm going to say. What was your point, sorry, about what was the point that you just made?
I was talking about secrecy laws.
Right.
Let's talk about
let's talk about what happened during the...
So now may be a good time to remind everybody to retweet this link and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you follow us on Twitter. Again, that is at WD Newswire. We will be having content posted there throughout the week, again, on this full extradition hearing. And for those of you who are, maybe just be joining us right now, you are watching the Watchdog live. So I think that everybody kind of wants to pick up on something. Sarah, I will let you take it from here.
Well, I think I would like to talk about what happened when Julian Assange got up and about the conditions he's being held under. Basically, there was a moment where the judge interrupted the proceedings to inquire about Assange's ability to follow, because he seemed very sleepy and he was yawning a lot. And then he got up and basically said that he wasn't able to concentrate because he wasn't participating in any way in the proceedings. He's sitting in this glass box at the back of the court, completely isolated from everything else. He's seeing everybody, just the backs of everyone's heads except for the judge, and he's having no access, or he was complaining that he was having very little access to his lawyers, and that even when he does talk to them, that he's being overheard by the prosecution, and there are microphones above him, and there's the two guards. And what I found very interesting, first of all, that is an interesting moment, because talking about, the conditions he's being held under, but also I found it very interesting how the prosecution reacted, and I'd love to hear what you guys thought of that.
Just to give give a little context for those who don't know what the court would look like. He's in this glass box in the back of the courtroom, seeing the back of everyone's heads except for the judge who's looking down at him, and has no meaningful communication with his legal team, meaning no privileged legal conversations. He can only pass notes through this little slit in the glass between the dock and the rest of the court. So it's very difficult to participate meaningfully in his own legal defense. And so he was saying that why even bother asking me if I can concentrate if I can't participate in this? All he could do was watch the proceedings from behind. And so he has asked through his legal team to be let out of the dock and to be able to sit with his legal team to be able to have these kind of confidential conversations.
Mm-hmm. And we're expecting an application for that to be made tomorrow. And I guess what's important to raise for people that are kind of new to this all is that this falls into the context of his time in the Ecuadorian embassy, where we now know that he was being spied on, I think, 24/7 through this company UC Global. And that included the conversations that he was having with his lawyers. And I think in the hearings in May, we're going to hear, completely, I think it's going to be completely brand new evidence about, I believe there is a worker within the Ecuadorian embassy that's given a statement kind of outlining some of this spying on him and his legal team.
There are two anonymous witnesses from UC Global to talk about the surveillance on Assange in the embassy.
Mm-hmm. Has any of that been on the public record before?
It was just mentioned so far, and there are Spanish proceedings underway against that security company, and so they've given private testimony. And so El País has covered that really well.
Yeah, if we could provide some context to the viewers right now who may not be familiar of the significance of UC Global, can you describe a little bit about that?
Sure, it's a Spanish security company that was hired to surveil, initially to protect Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. But in 2017, when Lenin Moreno's government took over, the job changed a little bit. And David Morales, the head of UC Global, stands for Undercover Global, traveled to the United States and went to Las Vegas to a security conference. And there we learned recently that he met with one of Trump's major financial backers, Sheldon Adelson. And he came away with a contract that was something to do with providing security for Adelson's yacht. But we also know that he has a side contract to surveil the Ecuadorian embassy for the U.S. intelligence services. And so they're planting microphones and cameras throughout the Ecuadorian embassy, completely invading Assange's privacy, including in where he thought was the only private place to speak with his lawyers, the women's bathroom. They have cameras and microphones. So it's an incredible intrusion that was sent to the CIA. And while visitors were being spied on, they had to leave their phones at the front desk at the Ecuadorian embassy, and those phones were then hacked. Or the batteries were tried to taken out.
They would take them apart.
They would just take it apart.
They could pull them apart. There was in El País's great coverage. They're a Spanish newspaper that's been doing most of this coverage. Astoundingly, this is not something that the U.S. press is covering, even though it is a CIA-backed espionage operation against a diplomatic embassy inside the United Kingdom. And one example in El País's coverage of how people were targeted, and they were going after visitors who came in to see Julian Assange. They were going after journalists, attorneys, and they were going after any Russians that came in there. So Russians or Americans, those were like two nationalities that they were really interested in. Ellen Nakashima is a reporter for the Washington Post, and in their coverage, they say that she does a lot of cybersecurity stories. I think she worked on some of the NSA stories as well. And she was in the courtroom with Nathan and I when we were covering the Chelsea Manning for some of the days that Washington Post were covering. She came to do that in the first days of the coverage for that. And Ellen went to the embassy and they tried to steal her phone battery. And there's an amazing statement in the coverage from El País that the employee admits, I don't know why you put this in writing, but it was actually in a record that I tried to take her battery, but she came back and asked for it. I mean, this is incredible. Why are you admitting that you did that? But apparently they're trying to take things that would make it possible to track journalists, but also they wanted to be able to get in so that they could turn these devices into tracking devices and make it possible to follow these journalists around. It's an astounding case. It's just it's an operation where I did an interview with CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou, and he points out that the CIA got burned back in the 1970s from targeting journalists. We heard in the church committees and the Pike committees in the U.S. that this was something that was out of bounds, and whether it's just this kind of exception to the rule, we don't truly know, but we know that there's something about WikiLeaks that has opened this can of worms where now the government is feeling like it can target journalists who went to this embassy.
So the U.S. has had a window into Assange's legal strategy for years now, and so that's what he was referencing in court today, saying when he wanted privileged legal communication with his lawyers, he said, "I think my lawyers have been spied on enough," and that's what he was referencing.
And they have the confidential papers.
Right. Yep.
And I think it was interesting that the judge said that she didn't feel that she had jurisdiction or had the ability to decide, make a risk assessment about him to be able to get him into the court, to be, to sit in the court with his lawyers, and basically insinuating that he's some kind of mass murderer, and where his defense attorney reminded her that this is an intellectual, soft-spoken man, and that, this was probably not the case. And then that's when the interesting happened, which is when the prosecutor, when David Lewis stepped in and actually said that he as well thought that, it should be fine for him to be in the courtroom. And he was basically defending Assange's right to be in the courtroom and to have access to the proceedings and to his lawyers. And that's where I was thinking, what do you think is the reason for that? Is that a fear of a mistrial being called if the abuse gets too strong? What is the motivation behind, or does he just want to make, does the prosecution just want to appear very nice and fair? Or
Probably both are benefits. He gets to look like, he's very sensitive to Assange's due process concerns, while putting it on the judge to not let him out of the dock. Meanwhile, depriving him of his due process rights either way.
It also has no effect on whether they're able to extradite him or not. If you let him sit at the table, everything's still going to unfold as it's going to unfold. I think the point that you're making is, why does it seem like the judge is the one who's more hostile to Assange than the prosecutor? And why is it she that's hearing there's a way to do this? You could have a security guard standing by him in case he would try to get up and leave. I don't know why he would do that, but in case he tried to just book it out of the courtroom and run, you have a security guard there to grab him. I don't know if there's a concern that someone from the press is going to interact with Julian Assange, probably, or that somebody from the public gallery might try to have an interaction with Assange. Seems like that might be a little more difficult, but it's in the realm of possibility for the prosecution. They don't see any reason why it couldn't be done. Then the judge, happening in what I understand is a courthouse where counterterrorism cases are prosecuted, she's just thinking in terms of national security, and immediately it goes to her mind that we don't have this worked out with the security yet in order to figure out how to manage Julian Assange, so I can't say yes to this and I can't approve it. And it wasn't really clear when we left that they knew what the defense should ask for. Let's just, not to confuse people who are viewers, but I think it's kind of fascinating that what started out was the judge implying that they should make a bail application to the judge. But why? That's not going to be granted, and the prosecution's just going to deny it, and we'll be back where we are. It would be a total waste of time and a total waste of court resources and the judge's time and everything, because you'll have to make a ruling on it, and that's not what they're seeking. Yes, we don't think Julian Assange should be in Belmarsh right now. He should be out of jail and able to make his defense like any other person in these kinds of cases is typically able to do. But that's not what they were asking for. They just want him to be able to sit with his attorneys, and they're not giving any like straight answers of how they could pursue that fix.
Tomorrow morning, we expect there will be some kind of defense submission on that. Don't know exactly what form it'll take. We know it won't be a bail application, but they're going to ask in some way to have him out of the dock, we expect.
Yeah, actually, I was just going to ask you about what we can expect looking ahead before we wrap up. I know we are all probably pretty careful to make predictions in this case or to make judgments. But if you would like to maybe just explain what we can expect for tomorrow. And then, of course, for those who are watching, this is not the end of this full extradition hearing. The second portion of it will resume May 18th and should last about 3 weeks. The extradition process can take a very long time. It could take even years, but remember that everything is always subject to change as well as far as the scheduling. So if you could leave us off with maybe what we can all expect in the coming months. And everybody that's watching, once again, you are watching the Watchdog Live. We are a new organization. Tara Kadad founded this organization. Make sure that you do follow on Twitter at WD Newswire, and also go to the website, thewatchdog.net.
Just for tomorrow, yeah, so we'll hear from the defense. They'll make some kind of submission about whether he could be out of the dock, is what we left off with anyway. And then the government will finish the last parts of its argument opposing the defense claim that this is a political offense and that should be a bar to extradition. So that'll wrap up tomorrow, and then, as you say, we continue for 3 weeks beginning May 18th. And then we're going to have several witnesses, both live and written testimony. We're going to have witnesses on the First Amendment, on the Espionage Act, on WikiLeaks' harm minimization process. We're going to hear kind of a lot more detail about the arguments that were fleshed out in court this week.
And then also, too, for our guests, please quickly just let everybody know where they can find you and where they can find your work. These are the people to go to when it comes to looking for information on this case. Kevin, in particular, has been live tweeting. I myself have been checking his Twitter quite frequently lately, myself and many others as well. So if you could start, Sarah, and just let everybody know your Twitter and where they can find your work.
So I'm on Twitter since 2 days approximately, but I'm going to be on there a lot more, so I'm going to be starting to tweet a lot more. So my Twitter handle is Sarah H. Marbrook.
I am with the Courage Foundation. We run the public campaign to defend Assange and WikiLeaks at defend.wikileaks.org, and I tweet from Courage Foundation's handle at CourageFound on Twitter.
And my name is Taylor Hudak. I'm an independent journalist and co-founder of Action for Assange. You can follow me on Twitter at _Taylor Hudak.
And I am Tariq_Haddad, and I don't like to promote myself very much, so I'll hand it over to Kevin.
I am Kevin Gostola again, and you can find me at kgostola, KGOSZTOLA. And the reporting that I've been doing is published at shadowproof.com. And thank you.
So I want to thank everybody one last time for watching, for tuning in. We will be holding another podcast tomorrow with some other very special guests. Tarek and I will be hosting that event again, and you could watch out for us. It'll be around 7:30 p.m. GMT time. So thank you guys, and we will see you tomorrow.